Pride/Prejudice, Chapter 3, Segment 3. "All I ask," Jane said, "is that you not come between Mr. Darcy and his friend." "That I can safely promise," Elizabeth said with a smile. "It's you who is doing that." "But I don't wish to." "You will have to make up your mind to it," Elizabeth said, "unless you want to lose your chance at a happy marriage. I know you don't like to put yourself forward, but if ever you were to fight, now is the time. Mr. Darcy loves Mr. Bingley as possessively as any man with a pretty wayward young wife, and is outraged at his friend's least show of independence. This love for you is probably the first time Mr. Bingley has ever stood up for himself over a woman, or at least a young lady worthy of matrimony." "Even if I were willing to fight, as you call it," Jane said, "I don't see what more I can do, and remain within the bounds of propriety." "Dearest Jane," Elizabeth said, "all you need do is support Mr. Bingley. Nothing improper. He has undertaken all the combat so far. He has made a declaration as bold as a rebellious colony's defiance of its imperial government, and is likely to result in the usual consequences, military occupation, and greater restrictions on trade." "From a trial to a siege, and now a revolution," Jane said. "That's exactly what it is," Elizabeth said. "Mr. Bingley has proclaimed his autonomy and announced his desire to separate from the former monarch of his affections. Now Mr. Darcy is sending out the recruiting officers and the press gangs, ready for a prolonged and bitter war and quashing of an insurrection. But remember which side prevailed in the last such contest." "If you are speaking of the French Revolution," Jane said, "I refuse to be responsible for loosing the terror and the guillotine upon Netherfield." "I can think of some heads that ought to roll," Elizabeth said, "but I was referring to the Americans." "Were those your true sentiments?" Fitz asked Charles that night. "Is that the only reason you allow me my pleasures, that I am a great tall fellow who bullies you into surrender?" "Of course not," Charles said. "But you must admit that you sometimes talk as if you don't like me very much, and you certainly don't respect me. I feel less like your friend than your whore, pretty and accommodating enough for use in private, but not fit to be seen in polite society." "Good God," Fitz said, "all this from a bit of drawing-room nonsense. I meant only that you are not some wild Lochinvar or roaring boy out of Walter Scott or Wordsworth, but a rational, unpretentious young Englishman, a respectable gentleman of property and fortune, if anything too prone to follow the counsel of others." "And I was merely trying to introduce some sense into that ridiculous discussion," Charles said. "Bring it down to earth instead of that up-in-the-air philosophical tone of all your conversation." After a strained pause, he added, "You know, Fitz, I've often wished I were more the heroic ideal. You'd have to woo me then instead of—" His mouth closed in a sad little smile. "So you do feel coerced?" Fitz lay down on the bed and stared at the underside of the canopy. "What do you want? A declaration of love? Last night, as I recall, you practically begged me to help you with your trouble. In fact, your entire mood was extremely abject." "Oh, now you're baiting me," Charles said. "I'm sorry, Fitz. At the moment, all I can think about is Miss Bennet. I told you before I think of her when we—" "Thank you," Fitz said, "for reminding me." "You said you think of Elizabeth," Charles said. "I wasn't sure I believed you at first, but after these past couple of days I'm convinced. You goad her with your superior manner and exalted language." "And look how she stands up to me," Fitz said. "I've never met a woman, or a man, come to think of it, who could hold her own in debate with me." "It's not my idea of lovers' talk," Charles said. "And your Miss Bennet is not my idea of an interesting woman," Fitz said. "How fortunate, then," Charles replied, "that you are not courting her." "Courting," Fitz repeated with what was becoming a habitual sneer whenever he spoke of the woman. "You will have to stop, you know, before she begins to believe you have serious intentions." "I do," Charles said. "After this ball I promised to hold, I'm going to ask her to marry me." Fitz's heart leapt in his breast, and his breathing became labored. He could feel the color rise into his face, the whoosh of blood in the veins of his neck like a whisper of warning. Apoplexy, they called it. Don't be silly, Charles, Fitz said when he could speak. Silly, Charles shouted. I am not silly. You are jealous and cruel and spiteful. On the contrary, Fitz said, I am attempting to look at the situation from a perspective of reason and detachment. You're in no condition to ask any woman to marry you. You lack the experience to tell when a lady returns your regard and when she is merely dazzled by your fortune and youthful vigor. Yet you're willing to let Georgiana marry me in this deplorable condition, Charles said. Fitz gave a snort of dry laughter. Don't bank on it, Charles. My consent to an understanding between the two of you would depend entirely on your assurance that all attentions to other women were at an end. Charles at least had the decency to look abashed. I'm sorry, Fitz, but honestly, that's only this idea that you and my sisters cooked up between you. I've been happy to go along with it when I was unattached, but where love is concerned, I must choose for myself. Yet surely I can advise, said Fitz, in this most important decision of a man's life. I've heard your advice, Fitz, Charles said, and browbeat me as you will, subdue me with your superior strength. This time I will make up my own mind and please myself. Charles's tone and manner were all calm resolution, no longer the protesting, eager boy. As he readied himself for sleep, Fitz reminded himself yet again that he must tread very carefully. From inconvenience to mortal danger was but a distance of a few missteps.